Hello, everybody. Welcome to my Boomer Buddies podcast, where we tell it like it was and is. As many of you know who are regulars, we touch on nostalgia, whether it's music, TV shows, movies, history. We cover anything that's boomer. Well, today we have an original Boomer Buddy back after a hiatus. I don't know. He may have been traveling the world, going to all the hot spots because he's kind of a big deal. We're so glad to have him back. Mr. Quincy Stringham, good to see you again.
I was glad to be here. I've moved across the country since I last spoke to you. So yeah, I've been busy, and my hot spots include going to the grocery store and going to finding the hamburger joint where I now live and this sort of thing. So yeah, it's life in the fast lane.
That's you all the way. Quincy, we're going to talk about some nostalgia, boomer nostalgia, the age right after World War II when the first wave of boomers started taking advantage of the newer innovations. I want to ask you, what was the most important post-war boomer development in your mind?
Well, it probably doesn't rank up there with some of the more technical things or some of the other things like drive-in movies and restaurants and ballpoint pens and vinyl LP records, power steering, the pill, credit cards, Velcro, automatic transmissions, stereo, super glue, optic fiber, computer hard disks, hula hoops, frisbees, liquid paper, and Teflon.
That's a lot of innovation.
But in my life, they didn't, other than maybe the hula hoop and the frisbee, they didn't have the impact of what we're going to talk about is the transistor radio. That was the thing that had the biggest impact on my life and many of my generation. It opened up a whole different world for us. We now had tunes that could go with us.
Portable. When did you get your first transistor radio, and do you remember what kind it was?
Yeah, I do. The transistor was actually invented in 1947 by Bell Labs. And then in 1954, Just Instruments, in conjunction with another technologic company, came out with a model number TR1. It cost $50 at retail,
Wow.
which doesn't sound like anything, but that was equivalent of, I believe, $400 in those days. So it wasn't something you just bought for your little kid. It was a very rare, it was not a mass market item at that point.
Yeah.
It wasn't until 57 that they started marketing it in the States, and RCA Victor was the first one to really try and do more of a mass thing. And then a new company out of Japan by the name of Sony developed one, and they were the ones that really made the big initial impact in the States. In 57, they imported 100,000 of them into the States. But it was still expensive. It still wasn't just what it became in the 60s. But in about I believe it was either 59, 60, right in there sometime. I was a little 9, 10-year-old rock and roll fanatic and living in the suburbs of New York City. And my dad worked in New York City and took the train into work every day and walked through Grand Central Station in Midtown Manhattan. And every day he walked twice, going and coming, he walked by an electronics store in Grand Central. And in the window, at about that time, they had a big display on the latest craze of transistor radios. And he just showed up one night at home with this bag for me and handed it to me. He said, "Here, I think you might like this." Now, it wasn't my birthday. It wasn't Christmas. I hadn't achieved straight A's on my report card, obviously. And there was no reason for it. It was just out of the blue. My dad was a consummate musician. He could play the piano. He could play all the hits of the 30s, 40s. He could sit down at a piano, play for 2 hours without looking at music. And he loved playing John Philip Sousa's marches, all sorts of stuff. So he just loved music. He gave me this bag, and I opened it up. I hadn't been nagging for transistor radio. I knew what they were, but I hadn't started into, I need one of these yet. But I opened it up, and there was this transistor radio. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is cool. And then I was excited. And it wasn't just a transistor radio. It had a little counter unit that you put the transistor radio in, plug the little plug in on top, and it became a little countertop radio as well. I mean, it was really, really cool. And as a matter of fact, here it is.
Oh.
That's the very radio right there.
And what was the year your dad bought that?
59 or 60. There it is right there.
Oh, classic.
So I still have it. It still works. This was a brand I'd never heard of, and I thought my little 10-year-old brain thought, well, he could have gotten me a Sony. But he said the guy in the store told him this was the best one they had. It's a leather case. I mean, a real leather case. It's made by Hitachi, which later became a very well-known brand out of Japan. But I'd never heard of it. So I had to be proven to me that this was not just some cheap piece of junk, which it wasn't. Anyway, so that's where I got it. And that became my companion for the next decade, pretty much.
You said it was your companion. How attached were you, literally? How were you attached?
It was one step away from being surgically implanted on my hip. It didn't quite go that far. It went to my friends' houses. We'd sit around with our transistors. I had on my bicycle, which was my mode of transportation all around town in those days, I had a little saddlebag off the back of my seat. This fit in it perfectly. So I had tunes as I would cruise it around town, and this was like my first car stereo. The only thing was missing was the car and the fact that it wasn't stereo. The important thing was I could listen to Chubby Checker and Bobby V and the Four Seasons going down the road.
So you're mobile
Yeah,
and you've got that in your saddlebag and
yeah, yeah,
you're feeling freedom. Did
yeah.
you ever use it to pass the time when you're doing chores or
Yeah,
anything
well,
like
yeah,
that?
I had no shortage of chores in my childhood, and my dad actually paid me to do chores. He didn't give me an allowance, but he paid me to do chores, and he paid me $1.25 an hour, which was like the minimum wage at that point,
Hmm.
and with no taxes. I was raking in the bucks, so I always had more money than my friends did. But they got allowances. They could never figure out how come I had money because I worked all the time, So
Yeah.
I had money. It kept me company in the yard when I was doing chores. Sitting there weeding the garden or cleaning the gutters or trimming the ivy off the end of the house, just whatever, chopping logs, whatever he had me doing. I did that. Summertime, I listened to a lot of baseball games on it. I was a Mets fan. I survived their terrible years in the early days, But I listened to the Mets and I listened to the Yankees too, depending who was playing that day when I was out working, and with their broadcasters. And as a matter of fact, I still sometimes I'll listen when I watch a baseball game on TV. I'll turn the volume off and listen to the radio feed, which is great, except sometimes it doesn't match up exactly with the timing. And so
Yeah,
you
right,
get
right,
you
right.
get a half a second preview of the guy's going to hit a home run.
And you had some great announcers to listen to out in New
Yeah,
York.
the Mets were Ralph Kiner, Bob Murphy, Lindsey Nelson, and the Yankees were Phil Rizzuto, Al Allen, and Red Barber, the legendary Red Barber. Yeah, so I got to listen to those guys. That's who I listened to. Another baseball analogy or story was in 1960. You may recall the Pittsburgh Pirates played the New York Yankees in the World Series, and one of the most famous home runs ever hit in baseball was Bill Mazeroski's home run in the seventh game to win the series for the Pirates. I was riding home in the school bus from junior high school. Now, as I mentioned, I was a Mets fan. I was not a Yankees fan. So I'm riding in the bus. I'm listening to the radio up to my ear, along with all the kids surrounding me. Mazeroski hits that home run. Without thinking, I whooped and yes, yelled out, excited. All of a sudden, everybody's eyes turned to me. Everybody else was moaning the blues, and I'm cheering. And all of a sudden, it became very evident that I was cheering, and I'd blown my cover.
Whoops.
And all the Yankees fans turned at me. Now, no, there was no violence that ensued, but it looks could have killed.
That's a great story. So how did your transistor radio affect your everyday world as a preteen and then a teen? I'm curious.
Uh, it was just around all the time. At night, after I'd go to bed and you're supposed to turn the lights off and go to sleep, I would, just like so many kids in my era, the radio went under the pillow. Now, my transistor radio was upscale. It was a 6 transistor. The standard mostly were 4s, but I
Mhm.
had a 6, so I had felt like I had, the cream of the crop. But this transistor was still a transistor, still pretty tinny. But you put it under a pillow, all of a sudden you got bass. That muffled thing through the
Yeah.
pillow, it gave a little bass tone to it. So I actually liked listening to it through the pillow. I just have memories of laying there at night listening to the late night disc jockeys, and sometimes you could pick up stations outside your actual geographic area and listen to some different stuff. There are certain songs when I hear them, it takes me right back there. And I was thinking about this before we started today, and one that comes to mind that every time I hear it, I'm 11 or 12 years old, whatever I was, listening to this thing at 2 in the morning on WINS or WABC, and it was "Crying" by Roy Orbison.
Oh,
And with that crescendo at the end where his voice goes through the stratosphere, it used to give me goosebumps. And to be honest, it still does. But that song is, to me, that always takes me right back there.
well, I'm a few years younger than you. We both imprint from back in the day, the music we listened to and we both associated to the times in our lives. I got my first transistor radio, and so did my brother, Christmas of 1966.
Hmm.
Okay. I believe it was an RCA. I remember it was black, and we had identical ones. And I can remember we had a neighbor guy staying overnight in our downstairs, and it was unfinished at the time. And we would listen to hear how many times we could hear Last Train to Clarksville and Talk Talk.
Yeah, the Music Machine.
There are some others. Let's see, 96 Tears, Question Mark, and
Hmm.
Mysterious. That was still playing. Cherish by the Association. But I can remember that, and we just loved our little transistor radios.
Yeah, yeah,
Just a few years later than you, but it still had an effect. We felt so free. And I
yeah,
would do chores out in the yard too. I couldn't go play ball with my buddies because I had to crawl on my hands and knees along the sidewalk with the hand
yeah.
shears. There's no weed whips then.
Yeah, that was me too. I was always, I can't come. I got to work.
Yeah, good memories of having the transistor radio. Something I want to ask you, Quincy, was there a defining moment when you were listening to your transistor when you heard a group or a band or a song for the first time and it changed your
Oh
life?
yeah, yeah. It was in the first part of '64, and I was in ninth grade, and we would tend to hang around. We go to somebody's house after work, after school, often, And we had a radio. I had my bike, so I still did ride it in ninth grade a little bit. But I rode my bike to this guy's house, and I had the radio with me. And we're sitting up there in his room with four guys up there, I think. We're all just hacking around. Did you ever hear that phrase?
No, no.
Hacking around.
We'd say
H-A-K-I.
messing
Yeah,
around.
it's messing around, but we call it hacking around. What'd you do when you were out today? Nah, but this is what your parents would say. What'd you do while you were gone? Nah, nothing. We're just hacking around. That sort of thing. I don't know, maybe it was just my localized thing. But anyway, we were up there hacking around, having things that 13, 14-year-old boys talk about, and with the radio on in the background. And the afternoon DJ came on. He said, all right, we have the biggest group that you've all been waiting to hear, and it was the Beatles.
Ah,
And they've been talking about it. We've been hearing about this group from England, but nobody had actually heard them. So they said, we're going to play the Beatles' first single release in the United States. And they played I Want to Hold Your Hand. The guys just kept talking, and this thing hit me like a lightning bolt. I had never heard anything that sounded like this before, and I yelled out, hey guys, shut up, I want to hear this. And so they quieted up a little bit, and I listened to it, and then the DJ said, all right, we're going to play it again.
yeah.
So he played it over again. And by the time he finished playing it the second time, I was up. I said, all right, guys, I'll see you. They said, where are you going? I said, I'm going down to the record store. So I went out and jumped on my bike, rode down to our little town to the record store, and I'll be damned, they had the record right there. And it was in the picture sleeve. So I bought it. And I was really excited. I took it home, put it on my record player, and I played it, and I played it, and I played it, and I played it, and I played it. And after I played it, how many times, I said, well, let's see what's on the other side. Now, in those days, the B-sides were usually garbage. They're just filler. And so I didn't have much expectation, but I turn it over, and as most of you or many of you will know, the B-side is I Saw Her Standing There, which was just as good as, I Want to Hold Your Hand. And so I go, oh my gosh, two great songs. So this little radio, first place I heard the Beatles, right on that little radio. So that's pretty cool,
So it basically gave you a boost up. You're a musician to this day. That probably helped you get along into becoming a musician.
Oh yeah, it's just all the music that I absorbed through that thing over the years. Yeah, I also still have that 45, which I'd show you, but it's still in a moving box. I can't access it right now, but I do have it still.
I was going to ask you about that, but knowing you and some other shows we did,
Yeah.
you actually supplied pictures to me of 45s you were talking about, and that's pretty cool that you have all that. All right, Quincy, so that brings me to the question, when did the transistor radio stop being as important to you as it was during your preteen and teen years?
Well, I think several things happened. Like I mentioned, I quit riding my bike, pretty much. That my tunes on the road with my bike stopped. I got a stereo in my bedroom. Now it wasn't a heavy duty stereo, but it had two speakers and it was like a real stereo. And I got a driver's license with a radio. You had the radio in the car, you had the stereo in your room, and I also was getting to the point where I was being a little bit more picky in how the music sounded, and with the stereo, the music quality was definitely better. And equally, if not more importantly, you could play it a lot louder, much to my parents' dismay. And that also was the point where the music business, what we were listening to was back in the early days of Transistor, what we listened to was what was the top 40. You didn't buy albums. I bought like 3 or 4 albums before I was 13. I bought a Dwayne Eddy album, a Buddy Holly album, Peter, Paul, and Mary album, and an Everly Brothers album. That's the only albums I had.
Mm-hmm.
And the rest of them were all 45s. And then once the Beatles hit, we all went out and bought the Beatles' first album. And then you find that the industry started becoming more album driven.
Mm-hmm.
And our taste started evolving a little bit and developing and getting a little bit more. We were interested in more things. And so we wanted to hear the songs that an artist did that weren't the singles. And so the singles were still a huge thing, like when you were a teenager, and when I was a teenager, later on, but in 60, 65, 66, 67, 69, singles were still an important thing. But you were also listening to, you bought the Doors album so you could hear all the other songs on the Doors besides Light My Fire or whatever the group was. So yeah, the transistor radio slowly ended up in a drawer in my dresser or in my desk or something. It was there, but I didn't use it nearly as much. Although I did have a renaissance. I worked at a small grocery store for 5 years in the last part of high school and all through college. And one of my jobs was I drove the delivery truck and delivered groceries all over town. And they had no radio. So the transistor radio became my radio in the car. Another moment, like the Beatles, here the first time, it was summer of 1968. And I was sitting on my break before I went back to the store under a tree, just hanging out for 15 minutes. The news came on, and it was all about RFK had been shot the night before. And that's where I heard about that. Was sitting under that tree, listening again on this transistor radio. It kind of evolved into, after the RFK thing, I really didn't listen to it very much. And it's kind of like, this reminds me, as we were getting ready to do this, it reminded me of the parallel to the Peter, Paul, and Mary song, Puff the Magic Dragon. And the line that goes on the last verse, a dragon lives forever, but not so little boys. Painted wings and giant rings make way for other toys. And that's what happened.
Wow.
So, but I always knew where it was. I always had it, and it didn't get used for a number of years. And the counter stand that I told you about, that did disappear somewhere. I didn't throw it away. I wouldn't have thrown it away. But, and over the years you move around the country and you do different things, and somewhere along the line, unless it's still in some box I didn't unpack 15 years ago. It may turn up one of these days. You just never know. But at this point, I don't know where that is. But I certainly didn't throw it away.
My baseball cards disappeared, but I have a feeling those will never turn up.
No. Well, those we all went through. Our mothers were usually the culprits for those. I stored mine in shoe boxes, all organized by team and year in the basement. And I went away to college. My freshman year, my mom calls. We had a stream that ran through our backyard, and it flooded. And it came in and flooded the whole basement and turned them into a big glob of cardboard. And so I'm talking to her, and I'm in the Sunday night conversation that you have every 2 weeks or so. Mm-hmm. And we're talking, and she just says, "Oh, by the way," she says, "the basement flooded, and we threw your baseball cards away." And then she goes on something. I said, "Whoa, just back up, whoa. Back up. What did she just say? You threw them away?" She said, "Oh yeah, it's just a lump of cardboard." Just offhand to her. To me, it's like, what? You threw away the Hope Diamond?
By the way, Quincy, my 87-year-old mother, you are her favorite boomer buddy, which, over me even. She'll deny that she threw those out. I have a feeling that one of my siblings got a hold of them when I was away in college and whatever. So, Mom, you're off the hook there. Anyway, so we talked about innovations, Quincy, and the transistor radio. What a great innovation for us boomers, and it propelled us. You had quite a life because of that, where it took you.
It was just a little item, just a radio. But when you start thinking about it, when you decided to talk about this, it's amazing what comes up out of your mind. And another thing that we didn't mention was the transistor radios run on 9-volt batteries.
Yes.
They were developed for the transistor radio.
I didn't know that.
That was a new item just for these radios. So there you go.
I think us boomers have had it pretty good.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways.
Yeah. I was thinking about this radio about a year ago, and before I moved. I'd been in Chicago for 17 years, And I really hadn't seen it. And I knew it was here someplace, but I didn't know quite where it was. And it made me really anxious. I went down and I went through various boxes. I had a couple boxes that still hadn't been unpacked because you don't want to rush into these things. They weren't in those, but I did have a couple boxes of outmoded electronic equipment. And I dug and I dug and I dug through cables and all sorts of stuff that I didn't use anymore. And there it was. So that was great.
Hallelujah moment. So why don't you do all the listeners a favor, turn that thing on, fire it up, and let's see if we can hear a little sound.
The thing about this is, when I did find this again, they talk about tactile memories. Okay, I can remember the sound of that.
Click.
I can remember the feeling of that.
It's 100,000. Get our free gold investment guide.
Here.
Learn why now is the right time to own physical gold and silver. And
It still works, and then the click, you turn it off, just like 1961.
Oh, that's awesome, Quincy.
And it's got a little case right here with ear bud for you.
I remember strapping my transistor radio to the handlebars of my bicycle and I put the plug in my ear, and I remember hearing Stairway to Heaven for the first time on my transistor radio. I didn't have my license, riding the back trails to my girlfriend's house.
Yeah.
Cool stuff, Quincy. Flood of memories. All you boomers out there watching, please comment on YouTube if you're watching on YouTube, and let us know any memories you have with your transistor radio. What did it mean to you? Did it mean to you as much as it did to Quincy and myself? Very curious to hear that. And if there's any songs you remember listening on there, let us know. We'd love to hear from you. And feel free to comment, smash that like button, and subscribe. Really appreciate you watching My Boomer Buddies podcast. Quincy, you always bring great content and insight to the topics that we cover. Final word before we sign off from you.
No, this has been fun. It's been really fun just thinking about it before I went on. It brought back a lot of my own personal memories of my misspent youth, and this has been really fun. It was an important part of my growing up process. And when my dad bought this in the store, I did suggest to him that it wasn't the Sony, as I recall, but he assured me that the salesman assured him that it was the best radio that they had. And it turns out the salesman was right. Still working.
Now, Quincy's dad steered him right his whole life, it sounds like, because if you go back and check out some older episodes with Quincy on there, Quincy's dad, like he said, was a musician, and he gave Quincy as a teenager the final thumbs up to go upstate New York to a little festival called Woodstock as a teenager.
Right.
And so these things keep building. The transistor radio, going to Woodstock. Later on, you were on John Mueller's Winter Dance Party tour, and you met so many great musicians through all of this. And it probably started with that transistor radio.
Yeah, that's one of the early building blocks, wasn't it?
It was.
Yeah. It was a lot fun times back then.
Hey, for Quincy Stringham, I'm Rick Reed, My Boomer Buddies podcast. Thanks for watching. Hope you come back. Until then, we'll see you
around the block.